you see the wires? I see the loopholes. Let's dance. Step to the left, duck under the light. Adjust the monocle right on the eye. No need for shadows, no need for the dark. We're leaving a joke where we're leaving our mark. They locked up the vault with a destiny seal, but Sequence 9 knows exactly how to steal. A glitch in the rhythm, a slip in the rhyme. We're two red-haired ghosts stealing nothing but time. We don't do the killing, we don't bring the dread. Just a prank in the system to mess with your head. We're the Marauders, the kings of the Flaw, laughing out loud as we dismantle the law. Did you take the crown? Nah, I took their left shoe. A reality error served up for two. Pinch the monocle, give it a twist. We are the phantoms that never exist. Ba-da-da, pop-pop, sneak. Stealing the thunder, stealing the scene, the greatest inventors the world's ever seen. Unbreakable brothers, defying the fate, slipping right through your invincible gate. Sequence 9, baby, the ultimate trick. We're in and we're out, and we do it so quick. Watch your pockets. Check your rules. We just turn the universe into our fools. Close your eyes, let the rhythm take the weight. Two shadows dancing at the edge of fate. Red hair gleaming under a chandelier's glow. A velvet curtain for a private show. Can't you see the sparkle in a single glass eye? A crystal lens reflecting a beautiful light. We're not breaking rules, we're just bending the light, making sure the wrong feels perfectly right. Oh, it's a swindler's waltz, a soft shoe glide, with nowhere for your common sense to hide. In the gap of a second, in a glitch in the law, we find the beauty, every single eye's grin. Just a tilt of the monocle, a slide of the hand. We're the kings of a kingdom built on shifting sand. Take a sip of the sweetness, let the logic go dim. We've got a master plan, a prank, a whim. The system is a puzzle with a piece out of place, with a clever ghost living in the empty space. You feel the pockets lighter, but the heart feels full, caught in the tension of a gentle pull. Two of a kind, an unbreakable bond, selling you the moon and the great beyond. Sequence 8, promotion error, just a mistake in destiny. A loophole is a doorway if you know how to slide. A monocle is the chaos for a lounge chair seat, making the bitter taste incredibly sweet. Oh, it's a swindler's waltz, a soft shoe glide, with nowhere for your common sense to hide. In the gap of a second, in a glitch in the law, every synchronized grin. Just a tilt of the monocle, a sleight of the hand. We're the kings of a kingdom built on shifting sand. Trust in the duo, trust in the gleam. Life is but an error in a larger dream. Adjust the glass, check the time. Everything you own is now mine. Click, click, clack, buzz. Two minds, one spark, a synchronized error. Adjust the lens, the patterns, they're screaming. Copper crown architects of the great mistake. With a single crystal circle, the symmetry we break. Calculated mischief in a 5/4 beat, where logic and the punchline finally meet. I see the how, you see the why. Beneath the glass, the blueprints never lie. Not a prank, brother, it's a structural flaw. We're the ink that's leaking through the cosmic law. Analyze, deconstruct, deconstruct. The gears are stuttering, the system is tucked in a corner of a logic gate we designed. Two souls, one monocle, perfectly aligned. Cryptologists, we're reading the veins of the stars, breaking the locks and the binary bars. It's not magic, it's a glitch we found in the rhythm of the gears, in the math of the sound. One eye open, the other is a twin, deciphering the hole where the chaos crawls in. A scarlet flash in a world of code. Watch the reality explode. 7, 8, 11, 8, the pulse of the mind. Finding the secrets the designers declined. A riddle in a bottle, a joke in a vault. If the universe crashes, it's our favorite fault. If the universe crashes, it's our favorite fault. We don't follow the map, we redraw the lines between the once upon a time and the ending signs. The eternal wisdom of a rebellious youth. Whisper 7 cryptologists. 1-0 error. 1-0 found it. The loophole is a circle, the circle is a lens. Where the brother starts, the decryption ends. Cryptologists, we're reading the veins of the stars, breaking the locks and the binary bars. It's not magic, it's a glitch we found in the rhythm of the gears, in the math of the sound. One eye open, the other is a twin, deciphering the hole where the chaos crawls in. A scarlet flash in a world of code. Watch the reality explode. One lens, two hearts, 3 minutes to tear the logic apart. The code is broken. Gotcha. Two shadows dancing on the edge of the sun. The heist of the on has just begun. Not for the glory, not for the crown, just to turn the heavens upside down. Red hair glowing like a dying star. We've tracked the glitch, we know where you are. Forget the lightning, forget master's hold. Adjust the lens, fix the glass on the eye. Watch the logic burn, watch the sequence fly. Stealing the fire because we can. Prometheus rising, the error is born. The fabric of destiny is lifted and torn. With the spark in our pocket and a grin on our face. Sequence 6, the fire thieves call. The higher they sit, the harder they fall. The death of the heavens is finally complete. They called it a crime, we called it a toy. Architects of chaos, merchants of joy. Every rule is a lock, every law is a cage. But we've got the key to the final stage. One twin moves, the other one strikes. Synchronized madness, whatever we like. The arrow isn't a failure, it's a brand new light to burn through the dark of the cosmic night. Whispers 6, Prometheus, the spark is ours. Check the loophole, find the crack, steal the flame. Don't look back, reality stutters. Heavy glitch, the system screams, but the fire feels better in the hands of dreams. Prometheus rising, the error is born. The fabric of destiny is lifted and torn. With the spark in our pocket and a grin on our face. Sequence 6, the fire thieves call. The higher they sit, the harder they fall. The depth of the heavens is finally complete. Just a spark, just a break. The gods are fuming, but we've got the flame to thank. Error confirmed. Close your eyes, the curtain's coming down. The Redmond architects are back in town. But we aren't building jokes or plastic charms. We're slipping through the cracks within your arms. No mist to hide us, no smoke to blind. Just a crystal lens to see what we can find. A single circle, glass upon the ice, upon the eye, to watch your secrets bloom and slowly die. We are the dream stealers, the twins of the flaw, finding the loophole, breaking the law. A monocle glimmers in the depth of your head, walking the tightrope of the words you never said. Stitch by stitch, we're peeling back the screen, the most beautiful error that you've ever seen. Can you feel us? We're synchronizing deep, the flame-haired shadows in your heavy sleep. We found the pocket where you hide your fear. We found the pocket where you hide your fear. We'll take it with us, leave a glitching tear. Your childhood addict, the girl you used to know. It's our invention, now we'll watch it grow. The error pathway, the sequence 5. Stealing the spark to keep the prank alive. Left eye know the right, adjust the lens, make it tight. A perfect fit, a perfect depth. The world is stuttering, the rhythm's out of place. We're rewriting the memories on your sleeping face. The twins of fire now cold as glass, watching the centuries of your dreaming pass. We are the dream stealers, the twins of the flaw, finding the loophole, breaking the law. A monocle glimmers in the depth of your head, walking the tightrope of the words you never said. Stitch by stitch, we're peeling back the screen, the most beautiful error that you've ever seen. It's gone now. The secret you kept, the secret you kept, you took it while you slept. Just a glitch, just a monocle in the dark, sharp click. Two hearts, one rhythm, a crimson thread, a sharp crystalline clink of a monocle being adjusted. Two hearts, one rhythm, a crimson thread, in the halls of laughter where the jokes were spread. But the mirror is cracking, the reflection is wrong. A guest in the marrow where it doesn't belong. No mist in the air, just a glint in the eye. A monocle shines like a cold glass lie. Sequence 4, the hunger is silent. The parasite blooms invisible, violent. Behind the grin of a brother, a shadow takes root. Stolen thoughts, the forbidden fruit. One twin is a vessel, the other a ghost. A toast to the thief, a cry for the host. Sound of insects chittering under skin. Fred, George, the names start to fade. In the web of the era, the bargain is made. Not a soul being taken, but a life being worn. A brand new identity out of the torn. The monocle settles, the vision is clear. The parasite whispers what you shouldn't hear. Whispers the marauder, the thief, the error. It's crawling under the skin. Under the skin. Where does the joke end and the nightmare begin? A rhythmic pulse, a bio machine. The most terrifying prank that the world's ever seen. Sound of a monocle clicking into place. Interesting. Laughter is hollow, a recorded loop. The parasite sits in the family group. A monocle glints in the torchlight's glow. How many are him? We'll never know. The bond is a bridge for the worm to climb, stealing the self 1 second at a time. 2 bodies, 1 master, a quiet, organic disaster. Heartbeat slows, thump, thump. The drone remains, a single monocle, a single grin. Step right up, adjust your sights. Nothing is wrong and nothing is right. We used to sell fireworks, tricks, and a spark. Now we sell destinies spun in the dark. Welcome, dear friends, to the grandest debut, where the sky might be red and the oceans aren't blue. They wrote down the laws on their unbreakable stone, so we picked the locks and we made them our own. 2 brothers of chaos with fire in our hair, building an empire out of thin air. Forget what you know, leave your logic behind. We're hacking the system, we're hijacking your mind. Pinch the crystal monocle over the right eye. Watch the tapestry of heaven twist and untie. A flick of the wrist, a loophole in fate. The Mentors of Deceit are ready to orchestrate. Welcome to the cabaret of beautiful lies, where the truth is a joke right in front of your eyes. We're spinning the glitch, we're stealing the scene, the greatest illusion that reality's seen. What is false is now fact, what is wrong is now right. The red-haired conductors command you tonight. A psychological maze, a theatrical trap. We've drawn you a doorway right off of the map. You think you are winning, you think you are free. You're dancing a waltz that was written by me. We finish the sentence, we alter the rhyme, stealing your time. Genius inventors of sorrow and glee. Welcome to the madness of sequence 3. Did we fool you? Did we fool you? Welcome to the cabaret of beautiful lies, where the truth is a joke right in front of your eyes. We're spinning seen. The glitch was stealing the scene, the brain in that reality scene. What is false is now fact, what is wrong is now right. The red-haired conductors command you tonight. The curtain is falling. The prank is complete. Storm your sacred halls. We are the brilliant breathing mistake, the laughing crack within your walls. Two minds, one spark, a flash of red. We turn your absolute laws to jest. You looked for armies in the dread. You looked for armies in the dread, but we were already your guest. Secrets to the Trojan horse, the fortress falls from deep inside. A glitch in fate, an altered course. There is no truth, there's nowhere left to hide. You thought our mischief was a game, but we rewrote the cosmic frame. We rewrote the cosmic frame. Genius inventors of the end, we built a snare you couldn't see. Brother to brother, friend to friend, we forged the key to destiny. I lift the crystal to my eye, the monocle gleams, the heavens sigh. Your strongest shield was just a lie, the resistance is futile.
The resist is futile. The parasite blooms in the throne room. The deceiver has won. Sequence to the Trojan. The greatest prank is destiny undone.
Two sparks of fire in a world of gray, inventing the holes where the light slips away. Once we sold jokes in a box slips away. Once we sold jokes in a box made of tin. Now we're the error crawling under your skin. No fog in the reach, no mist in the eye, just a single glass lens where the centuries die. Adjust the monocle, tighten the screw. I'm looking at me, or am I looking at you? We are the worms of time, the glitch in the breath, 1,000-year loop in the second of death. Talk, tick, talk. The gears are grinding, the fabric is thin. Where does the prank end? Where do we begin? We stole the tomorrow you thought was your own. Two red-haired kings on a chronological throne. I'll take your childhood, I'll take your end. We're the mistake that the heavens can't mend. Sequence one, sequence one. The parasites is hungry, the clock is standing still. Everything is a loophole if you have the will. Look through the glass, see the writhing gold. Stories of brothers that can't be retold. We bipeds the laws, we cheated the gate. Now we're the parasites nesting in fate. Your pulse is a rhythm we choose to delay, stretching your now into infinite decay. A wink of the eye behind the crystal rim. The world is a joke and the lights are growing dim. We are the worms of time, the glitch in the breath, 1,000-year loop in the second of death. Talk, tick, talk, tick, talk. The gears are grinding, the fabric is thin. Where does the prank end? Where do we begin? We stole the tomorrow you thought was your own. Two red-haired kings on a chronological throne. Two souls, one error, one lens, forever. Don't blink. The clock just stopped. Don't blink. The rules are just suggestions. Logic is a prison, we found the key. Two hearts, one mind, a crimson heresy. We stole the fire, we burned the script. The fabric of the cosmos is starting to rip. Can you feel it? The hitch in the flow. A right eye shadow in the front row. Adjust the lens, fix the frame. The universe is just a raging game. I am the error, I am the lie. The bug in the star map, the tear in the sky. Sequence zero, the parasite's king. Hear the sound of the void as we sing. No more order, no more face. Just a glitch in the gates. In the gate, in the gate. It's not a mistake, it's an upgrade. Red hair flying through the digital storm. Two brothers laughing as the atoms deform. The law says no, but the loopholes say yes. We're the grand architects of this beautiful mess. Look through the glass, tell me what do you see? 1,000 versions of you and one version of me. Me, error. One lens, one eye, one final joke. The throne of the gods is going up in smoke. Is it a prank, or is it the end? In a world of lies, I'm your only friend. I'm the parasite in your prayer. I'm the shadow that wasn't there. Logic is dead. Error is born. I am the error, I am the lie. The bug in the star map, the tear in the sky. Sequence zero, the parasite's king. Hear the sound of the void as we sing. Two souls, one crown, one glorious sin. Where the system ends is where we begin. Checkmate, brother.